Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
In his autumn statement last year, George Osborne made a series of reforms to the way property taxes work, including a substantial hike on the stamp duty paid on homes worth more than £1.5 million. Some saw it as an attempt to frustrate Labour and the Lib Dems over their plans for a mansion tax, and it's apparently having an effect on the sales of the UK's most expensive homes. Ellie's been to find out more.
I will not allow house prices to get out of control and put at risk the sustainability of the recovery.
Gordon Brown, in his first budget as Chancellor, introducing a graduated stamp duty that stuck 2% on purchases of property worth more than £500,000. Fast forward 17 years, and you have a Conservative Chancellor tinkering with the tax again.
It's time we fundamentally change this badly designed tax on aspiration.
George Osborne said his changes would cut stamp duty for 98% of home buyers in last year's autumn statement. But it came at the expense of those at the higher end of the housing market. Properties worth more than £1.5 million were in for a 12% tax bill.
7 million. 2 bedrooms. Dream on. So I've worked out you only need to spend about £2.5 million, evidently not that hard to do here in London, to be landed with a stamp duty bill that's worth more than the entire amount I spent on my small flat.
Industry types say such high stamp duty bills have slowed down the market at the higher end, and that will affect the amount of money the Treasury earns in tax.
We've looked at the tax take between January and July of this year, and certainly, yes, the tax take is down in the sort of prime central London boroughs of Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster. And I think looking at last year's figures, we saw a slowdown in terms of the revenue being created in those boroughs versus the rest of the country. So in essence, the prime end of the market, the £1 million plus market, the tax take is slowing, and you could argue to some extent the measure has been counterproductive.
The Chancellor's changes came months before the general election, with the backdrop of Labour's mansion tax proposals. The decision may have been as much about politics as it was economics.
The Chancellor and his ministers will muse on the question of whether it's worth losing 2 or 3 billion or 1 or 2 billion pounds worth of stamp duty on houses that are very expensive, in order to be off the hook of the embarrassment of endless stories about how rich people are coming from overseas to buy properties in London. And if that stops, they might think it's a price worth paying.
The Treasury has downgraded its forecast for the amount of revenue stamp duty will bring in the last year of this Parliament by more than £2 billion. And it could be a slightly quieter autumn for some estate agents.
Ellie there, well, taking a look at the effect of the stamp duty changes. So let's remind ourselves how stamp duty currently works. In England, Wales and Northern Ireland, you must pay stamp duty land tax, stamp duty for short, if you buy a property. Until last December, it charged successively higher rates on the whole of the purchase price, a structure which saw it known as the slab tax. But in the 2014 autumn statement, Chancellor George Osborne announced a reform of stamp duty after criticising what he called a badly designed tax on aspiration. Under the new staggered system, stamp duty only applies to the amount of a property purchase price that falls within a particular duty band. So, up to £125,000, you don't pay anything. Then, on the value between £125,000 and £250,000, you pay 2%. Between £250,000 and £925,000, you pay 5%. Between £925,000 and £1.5 million, you pay 10%. And on the remaining amount, that's anything above £1.5 million, you pay 12%. Got it? Most home buyers benefited, but those who fell into the top band will pay more. If you spend £2.1 million on a home, Instead of the £147,000 you paid previously, you now pay £165,750. And the rates are lower in Scotland, where a land and buildings transaction tax was introduced in April this year. Well, we're joined now by The Guardian columnist Owen Jones, and our guest of the day, Jacob Rees-Mogg, is still here. We're not letting him go. Jacob Rees-Mogg, why is it bad economics to charge people buying houses worth over £2 million higher rates of stamp duty?
Well, as we were discovering from the piece, because it's actually reducing revenue for the government, that taxes should be set to raise money for the government to afford to do what it needs to do. And if you set rates that are so high that you don't get that revenue, that is unwise, but on top of that, you're also reducing the flexibility of the market. You want markets to have transactions. You want people to be able to move. You actually want foreign billionaires to think it is a good idea to buy property in London because they come here and they spend money, and we earn a huge amount of invisible earnings from the spending of foreigners in the United Kingdom. So you make it harder for people to buy properties, you discourage high-end transactions, you have an effect down the pyramid, and you get less tax revenue for it. So this may be passable politics, but it is not good economics.
Do you think it is just about politics? This was George Osborne just trying to show he would be fairer when it came to stamp duty, property taxes?
Probably a response at the time to the so-called mansion tax, a slightly gimmicky policy Labour stole off the Lib Dems during the general election. However, I mean, you know, I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to get me to defend George Osborne against one of his backbenchers. It's not going to happen. I actually just don't like stamp duty as a tax. I'd get rid of it, and I'd replace council tax, which is a very regressive tax. It's bad for middle income and low income people in this country, and stamp duty with a land value tax. So instead, what we should do is tax the value of the land. It's a very old idea. It goes back to that well-known lefty, the economist Adam Smith. In countries like Denmark and Hong Kong operate this, Pennsylvania, in America, we could go on. I think that's a better system, because what that would mean then is, because what is unfair at the moment is if you're rich and you happen to live in an area which is very desirable, you will accrue a huge amount of wealth, not for your own efforts, simply because you're living in a very desirable area. Whilst if you're a private renter, of which there are now 11 million, your rents are being hiked up. If you want a council house, you're languishing on a social housing waiting list. There's 5 million of them in that position now. So the whole housing crisis, we need to build council housing, regulate the private rented sector. And when it comes to home ownership, under this government, it's fallen. I mean, there's 250,000 fewer homeowners in England and Wales since your government came to power. It peaked over a decade ago, so it's failed in terms of promoting home ownership. And I think we can promote home ownership, build council housing and regulate the private rented sector, none of which this government is doing.
I mean, isn't it true? It just goes against the grain for Conservatives over home ownership if there are fewer people owning their own homes. And most people, I would put to you watching this, will say, who cares whether rich oligarchs are finding it more difficult to come and buy top-end homes here in London? That's a good thing.
I completely understand that rich oligarchs are not the most popular constituency to defend.
But well done for having a go.
But the question is whether by attacking them or viewing them as being the opponent, you take decisions that are economically disadvantageous down the housing pyramid. And I think stamp duty at 5% above £250,000 is very high. It's a big burden for people moving within family homes.
Obviously, I dispute. I mean, I would argue for a more progressive land value tax rather than that, so I won't go into those details. But in terms of foreign ownership, it's a really important point, because I don't know what the figures are now, but a couple of years ago, it was estimated that about 8 out of 10 new build properties in London were being snapped up by foreign buyers, often Russian oligarchs. Now, the problem is they're often left vacant, empty, at a time when lots of people simply can't get a home, and that's pushing up prices and making it unaffordable for the average home buyer because prices are so unaffordable.
I don't agree with that. I think the reason prices are going up is because we're not building enough houses. There's a lack of supply, and we need to tackle that. A lot of existing properties in London are actually owned by local people who are also finding it harder to move because of this tax. But it's reducing revenue for the Exchequer, so the government is limited in what it is able to do.
Well, we'll argue at cross purpose there, because I don't support a stamp duty. I'd replace it with a different, more progressive tax where rich people do pay.
I think there are difficulties with capital taxation altogether, because except when there's a transaction, you become highly distortive to behaviour, because there's no flow of income to pay the tax from, and therefore you force people to make inefficient decisions in terms of their allocation of capital.
What about Owen Jones' point, though, that the whole property speculation market has led people to cash in on their assets while twiddling their thumbs, rather than through work.
Oh, the assumption that house prices will rise forever is not a correct one. We have seen periods in the past when property prices have collapsed.
Has the government not actually fuelled that?
The government should not be in the business of trying to get house prices to go up or down. We've seen that type of demand price management from governments in the past, and it's a very
can I just say we are? That's what your government, I'm afraid to say, is doing. Well, just quickly, let me respond, Jacob. I mean, for example, Right to Buy, that gimmicky scheme, what that's doing is just pushing up house prices in this country. And the problem with the economic model, I mean, you're quite right, your government is catastrophically failing to build housing in this country.
It's getting better from the last government, as you know perfectly well.
I'm not going to defend New Labour's record, but I will tell you, your government's been in power. Your government's been in power for over 5 years.
Planning is a slow system, but it is getting there. The government really is doing.
We
need to be building 250,000 houses a year just to meet demand.
It's been lamentable, the record, and it was lamentable under Labour.
Yeah, but the problem is, can I just say, the problem with the economic model that your Chancellor currently has is we have an economic model based on inflated house prices, which leads to huge economic instability, as we've seen in the past. Now, what we should be doing is giving councils the power to build housing. That will create jobs, bring down the housing benefit bill, as well as reduce the waiting list. We should regulate the private rented sector. And let's look at home ownership, not by flogging off social housing as your government's doing and making that situation worse, but looking at, for example, stamp duty, replacing it with a more progressive tax like land value tax.
You have the last word there. Now, Labour's...
He always does.
Does he? All right, next time I'll make sure he doesn't.